अच्छा, तो इसमें फिर
वैसे ये आखिर में मेहर भी कुछ कहना पूछना है.
Thank you. मेरा question थोड़ा सा practical implications of what we have just talked about is कि आपने mention किया कि जी late 20th century में there was a resurgence of all religions around the world and we saw that worldwide. और सारे revival of the religions की एक movement चल रही थी and we know that almost all major religions emphasize on one thing for its survival, that is to have more children. And now we are seeing that happen recently, like even in most secular and developed countries, और उसकी secularization and industrialization के process की एक implication ये भी थी कि there was a reduction in fertility rates, more so because women were entering the workforce or delaying marriages or having, late children, and so there was a real big decline in fertility rates. और अब काफी secular societies are moving back towards their own survival question, जो traditional religion के अंदर भी आ जाता है, जिसमें हम Scandinavian countries में भी देख रहे हैं कि they're having these policies to help promote more children, have younger population as well. They're having different immigration policies, they're having different maternity and paternity policies. But on the second hand, we are also seeing a rise in more traditional religious values who are putting more limitations and emphasis on more traditional roles that women should occupy in the society, and emphasizing that there should be a ban on abortion rates, for example, all that. So उसमें आप कैसे कहेंगे, क्योंकि you talked about कि जी time को हमने mechanistic view में देखा है, so that process, how we experience time is very different for how men experience time versus how women experiences time, and that also varies on in which society they live in. Recently, yesterday, Taliban's put the ban. They emphasized that the woman should cover their from head to toe, and that the men of the house would be beaten or punished if they're not doing so. So, hum un values ko, like, how would you define all these processes? Whether they are within the religious, traditional religious values को हम uphold करना चाह रहे हैं, या हम cultural ancient values को uphold करना चाह रहे हैं, because a lot of debate is going on whether some of these things are embedded in the religion or whether they were part of those cultural norms that existed within those societies in a specific space and time at that time, और हम उनको ही revival चाह रहे हैं. So how do you think that this entire process is taking shape, and which values are we upholding, whether those are cultural values or whether they are religious values, और उनको हम कैसे differentiate करेंगे from the traditional religious values?
I think मतलब इसका एक basic तो जो resurgence of religion है in the modern period, मेरा ख्याल है आप उस पे बात I'm just going to focus on that aspect of आपका सवाल जो है इसमें it has dimensions that are reactionary in the sense that आप अगर देखें कि what are the different responses to the rise of modernity, the rise of some of these things that we're talking about, humanism, rationalism, modern science, modern technology, what have been the various responses when these changes take place, starting with Christian Europe, but since we're addressing the Islamic world, and we'll talk more about that another class. But so what we're saying about a lot of these movements of religious resurgence are a very specific response to modernity, which are not, which is rather what I would call reactionary, in the sense that it's not necessarily based on a very broad understanding of the possibilities of religious tradition, but focus on very specific modern and contemporary issues to navigate what religion is, right? So a question, for example, around, you mentioned women's dress. I mean, if you look back into time, if you just wanted to go and look into how much Muslims have cared about hijab and women's dress, if you go and start historically try to find writings, there's very little on it. I mean, some fiqh works, of course, along with all sorts of things. We'll talk about modesty. Men and women should have modesty. This is what you wear. It's like a footnote. It's not something that seems to have preoccupied Muslims previously to the modern period. I mean, it existed. I'm sure there were discussions of it, but mostly among the fuqaha about, but that issue, because of a particular process in which the Western world starts criticizing during the colonial period. There's major writings about this. Ernest Renan, other people in France and England who say, Muslim women are so backward. The men are oppressing them, forcing them to wear these strange clothing, which doesn't agree with the modern age, and so forth. The Muslim modernists respond to this by saying, no, Islam is only about modesty. We don't have to wear hijab. Look, this is a picture of my wife. In Egypt, you see, one of the early modernists like posed with his daughter without a hijab, right? This was a kind of a statement. So then there's a reaction to that, with other Muslims coming in and saying, no, hijab is central. You can't do without the hijab. It's one of the obligatory aspects of religion. It's so my point in this is that something which was in the traditional understanding was a part of religion, but something that was not discussed, was not front and center, was not a huge issue. There seems to be a lot of flexibility from a more kind of, if you looked at pre-modern societies more from an ethnographic perspective about how women dressed, it seemed completely different in all different parts of the Islamic world. Other than that, there was some concern with modesty, but even that, was culturally defined. As Ibn Battuta goes, is in his travels, you can see how women dressed in different places.
So I'm not just concerned about Muslim women's dress. I'm just talking about this revival of traditional religious values across different religions. You can see it among the Hindus, you can see it among Christians. Even in United States, it's the emphasis on women's fertility from that religious perspective. So I'm saying, why is there an emphasis so much on women and women's bodies and women's lives and women's time as a notion of promoting those religious traditional values?
So I was just giving an example, which one could pick up the similar examples from Hindu or Christian context, which I'm not as I wouldn't be able to explain as well as the Islamic concept. So I'm just giving you that as an example of a particular discourse of how something which is not important and not so central in traditional Muslim understandings, or one could say even traditional Christian or Hindu understandings, becomes central because of a particular back and forth discourse in which some people feel that there's an attack happening as part of, as modernization is going on, as a lot of religious values are being threatened over a period of a couple of centuries, where traditional modes of living and envisioning the world are falling apart. So one of the responses that certain religious actors or religious movements have is to focus on those things that are being criticized and double down on them, and make them into kind of symbols of restoring a kind of imagined past, right? So that's why, for example, a lot of these movements are called fundamentalist movements, right? So there are, or revivalist or resurgent religious movements in the, for example, Hindutva in India, or the religious right in the West, or the Taliban, or other groups like this, is that it's a new newly found, it's a interpretation of religion that's really based in the contemporary moment, in the sense of they are responding or redefining religions around contentious issues that have been criticized in the modern period. So something like, or that have, in which things have really changed a lot in the modern period. So women, at least that's one reason, that can be seen as one reason why women's issues have become central, because the position and role of women has transformed, immensely. One of the most clear differences between kind of how people lived a couple of centuries ago even and today. So if somebody's trying to revive religion and doing it in this kind of in a reactionary way, these issues become central. I mean, of course, the answer is wider than this, but I think that it's a particular interpretation of religion. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily, for example, even the first thing that you mentioned, that religions promote having children. I don't know if this is really true. I mean, of course, some religions, some people talk a lot about this, but whether this was actually a major goal is not, the only writings I've read are from 20th century in Islam, for example, from various 20th century mullahs who are writing about how it's important to do this. I have not come across this very widely. I'm sure such opinions might have been held previously, but perhaps nobody needed to say anything because it was a natural process. You just have children as they come along or something like that. But actually a kind of thing that we should have children in order to spread religion, I would think that's more of a kind of a modern concern.
It was. There's a whole field of sociologists who focus on just religious aspect of reproduction and population and the debate that all religions are now, even with the resurgence and this revival of religions, have started emphasizing more on traditional family roles, having children within the family, not outside of the family, and defining those boundaries. You can see these conversations happening right now in United States as well. And we have seen that with the US, Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade decision as well. So I think a lot of that has to do with religion, and their conversations of embedding those into traditional religious values. Like, what does traditional Christianity mean? Although United States Constitution is not religious at all, it's very secular, but they still uphold those values of God and family.
डॉक्टर साहब मेरे ख्याल से यहाँ पे ट्रेडिशनल कहना जिस माने में हम लोग बात कर रहे हैं वो इनकरेक्ट है. दिस इज मोर ऑफ अ कंटेम्पररी फंडामेंटलिस्ट लिटरलिस्ट understanding of religion, which is like a reflection of modernity itself, which externalities पे fixated है without and it is really far from the traditional understanding of religion, which is rooted in the spirit of the tradition and not the externalities. तो इसको आप बार-बार traditional कह रही ना, वो मुझे थोड़ी तकलीफ हो रही थी. और it also explains this whole Dr. Saab, sorry, बस ये मैं कहना चाह रहा था.
No, go ahead, Naeem, but जी.
I think when we say US is not US in constitution is secular, I don't think so. It's really true. US is a very Christian country, so very deep down in each and every aspect of their life, Christianity is a very, very dominant school of thought. And that's how they organize their rules, they organize their higher education, they organize pretty much everything. So on the surface, you can think probably mistakenly that it's a very secular country. No, it's not. It's a very Christian country.
So a couple of points. So एक तो ये जो what तबरूर साहब बात कर रहे थे, yes, so that's my whole point regarding that these interpretations of religion that are emerging as part of resurgent religion are fundamentalist interpretations of religion, that I think that people who study it from the outside sometimes don't make this distinction. In the popular discourse, these are sometimes called traditional, or this is what religious people think. I think that's absolutely false. That it's also about not what is found in a particular religion, it's what you emphasize. One can say, oh, Muslims have always believed that women should be covered head to toe. I mean, there are some texts that seem to be saying this. Doesn't mean that that's what Muslims have always emphasized. Or when they define their religion, that might be 1 out of 1,000 things that might be part of it. In some societies, people took it seriously. Some people didn't. But say a contemporary Muslim movement like Taliban or somebody else might say, oh, this is very central to what we do. So what's happening in the contemporary period, same with Christians, the way that they are making certain social issues regarding religion very central to religious identity is, to me, it's a new thing. It's really a part of modernity. It's a part of a religious response to modernity. It's not how traditionally people lived. Even those people that followed religion. So that's one point. What is Sarah? You're mentioning. I think it's a complicated issue. So the U.S. is an outlier in industrialized Western countries of how much people believe in religion. So it's way, way much higher than Europe. For example, church attendance in the U.S. is, I don't know the latest percentages, but it's well above 50% of the people. And several, I think a decade or two ago, it was like 80%, or some huge number like that. While in some place like Sweden is less than 10%. Even in places like Italy, where the Vatican is, it's like less than 20% or something. If I'm correct about that, I remember reading something like that. So, but nonetheless, this does not. But nonetheless, I would maintain that even in the United States, public life, or at least there's a huge argument that's going on. It's on kind of thing, and that's what's different maybe from Europe. But public life is secular. It's supposed to be, at least. Whether it really is or not, is another question. So this idea of particularly since you live in like North Dakota, it's much more of a Christian kind of place. So it depends on geography as well. It also depends on.
You're right. Like some pockets of the U.S. would be more liberal in that sense, but I lived in Michigan too. So Michigan was very religious as well. It's a very religious, I would say, on Midwest in general is very, very religious. And then you go to South.
Yeah.
South is very religious again.
That's true.
So I lived in New Orleans. It's not religious at all. It has its own culture.
So I think what people
has a very strong, dominant Black Christian religious tradition.
So I think there's a distinction to be made here between kind of values of the people versus kind of the official or public. Because I mean, one of the major aspects of religion in the modern period is the privatization of religion. So from a privatization of faith, what that has led to in Europe is a kind of eclipse of religion. That hasn't happened as much in the United States. So on a private level, there's a lot of religious people. And there's obviously some of them are trying to influence public policy, and some of it, of course, public policy has carried over from the Christian past, if you want to put it that way. But I don't know. I would not. I would say that the secularism, or the idea, at least on a philosophical or intellectual level, the way that the world is perceived, actually on a public level, it's not religious. It's and I think this is.
I think you are thinking about so for example, even a very small example is the theory of evolution. In many of states in the US, they don't teach in schools, right? And because how the schools and education system even work, like parents have a lot of say. So if parents are religious, it means they will pick and choose what topics would be taught and expressed in the schools in that sense. Same as if you look at the United States Senate, so look at the senators, how many of them are coming from a very, very religious background in that sense. So when they discuss all those policies and ideas, they are very much on the religious bent. And look at the even Supreme Court, the big debates are always about religion. It's always about religion at the end.
Yeah, yes, America is an interesting place in the sense of the role of religion is quite different from Europe. yeah. Anyways, let's. I did want to, before we part, did want to mention a couple of other things that illustrate some points that Martin Ling raises in his book. So just kind of changing topics in this. Just to be clear, Meher, when you're saying these debates are not so clear, these debates are based on religion, what do you mean?
I'm talking about within the United States context. It's a very complicated situation. Yeah. That's
right. Yeah, we could. Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's very complicated. So, all right. But as far as whatever the public, just last word on that, whatever the public practice of people might be, if you define modernity or the modern in some of the ways that we have been defining, the sense of giving a privileged place to modern science, to rationalism, to humanism, it's clear that the U.S. would fall on some level on if that's what in your secularism is, or those are some of the central points in it. I don't mean only political secularism, but in this philosophical sense, that the U.S., like other Western countries, would be very much fall under that. Those dimensions would be central to at least the public discourse. Anyways, I want to move on from that. So, going back to the idea of time. So another very important aspect of that Lynch talks about regarding the qualitative aspect of time is the idea of that in traditional, and really, again, he makes his claim of all religious perspectives, and there's different religions might view this or might frame this differently, but generally the idea is not one of progress or evolution, but really a kind of a regress or de-evolution, if one could say. So, for example, on some levels, societies might be improving or something like that, but the larger, on a micro level, it's not like complete decline, but the idea is generally an idea of decline. So if you look at, for example, the Islamic idea of prophecy, or even the Jewish and Christian idea of prophecy, when are prophets sent? When are, for example, why there are need for a prophet to be sent? God sends, in Islamic idea is that God sends prophets. There's a hadith that there's 124,000 prophets sent. So there's a prophet sent. Prophets are sent. I mean, when there's a need for them, right? Why is there a need for them? Because people have moved away from something which should be natural to them, because it's part of the fitrah of living according to the will of God, or being aligned with the nature that God gave them. When human beings are turned towards, for example, living in ways that are harmful to themselves or to others, that's when prophets are sent. So the theory is, in that case, is one of decline, which is punctuated by periodic interventions from the divine in order to bring a society back to or human beings back to a state in which they would be living up to their fullest potential, one could say, which is that they will be living according to the fitrah as God created them, which human beings alone among all creatures can, because of free will and more advanced intelligence, can go against, right? So a bird cannot will to go against its fitrah. An ant or a mountain or a cloud can't do that, but human beings can, right? They have the capacity to do that. And so, and generally the idea is that's what they're going to do. Unfortunately, starting with the act of Adam and Eve, right, in the garden, which had them exiled into this world. So that human beings have this possibility of choosing the wrong things, and that's what they do most of the time, or at least often. And prophets are sent to reverse that. Other theories, for example, the Hindu idea of the 4 ages, which is also found in the pre-Christian European traditions, Native Americans and others have similar ideas as well. Is again a theory of decline, right? There's a golden age, a time when things were most in conformity with the human and the divine were the most kind of working together, one could say it that way. And gradual ages, human beings far more and more away from the spiritual towards the material, towards again, not kind of living up to their highest ideals, but more and more so, there's more wrongdoing, evil, negative, and until we live in the Kali Yuga, right? So the dark age, which most interpretations of Hinduism, all of them generally say, it's unclear, some of when that started, but generally our present age is seen as the Kali Yuga, a dark age when human beings are at their furthest from a spiritual mode of existence, right? So it's actually so this is a qualitative understanding of time, but it's also something that's really the opposite of the modern perspective of progress and kind of a constant evolution, right? So, that's something very significant that I wanted to this class on modernity, is this concept of time and this idea of progress really being and of course religious people try to harmonize this. So I'm in the sense of trying to how can we work both religion and progress together? In some ways, are opposed theories. There's maybe ways of saying it, like I was saying, on a micro level, maybe there's can be improvements to society, but they're really rooted in different worldviews. At least one could argue that if you, all right, yeah. So that's one point. Martin Lings raises a number of other points that we don't really have time to go into all of them, but a couple of interesting things he talks about that illustrate that maybe we could, that perhaps the way we understand how traditional people lived or what happened in the pre-modern period can be revisited by giving a couple of examples. Something that, for example, literacy, right? That is again, widely celebrated. We should, there's whole drives in which, we should bring literacy to all the people that don't have it. And societies in Pakistan and other places are marked by how literate they are, right? So rates of literacy being low are seen as examples that these societies are filled with ignorant people, more or less. That there is a need to make people more literate. And so, it's something that nobody, I don't know if anybody's ever come across an argument against literacy. I had never seen it before I read this, book, but of course, he's not arguing against literacy as such. He's just pointing out that everything has benefits and limitations, right? That something like literacy actually has a lot of drawbacks and problems that we might not catch the eye, right? So, and perhaps we can be more sympathetic to this in the social media age, of just if you connect the idea of how, and this is something we'll come back to in another class as well when we read Neil Postman, how the medium and the message, to use Marshall McLuhan's distinction, how the medium and the message are related to each other. So something, what does an oral culture, how does it affect the consciousness versus a written culture? And, Marlings makes some really interesting points on that, right? A very, again, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but like a couple of things, that this idea of that literacy is able to preserve. Actually, I'll just open this up. So, can you think of any drawbacks of literacy, of going from a purely oral culture in which, everything that you knew is just kept in the memory, things are not generally written down, or if they're written down, there's people who know how to write or something. And generally, we think of literacy as a positive thing. But what could be some of the drawbacks or negative implications of literacy?
So I think this is the post-colonial critique of the idea of literacy in that sense. And I think there is a whole dimension of post-colonial critique in time and how we consider people literate, lazy people, like those people who don't organize their time from the Western standard are lazy nations, lazy people who aren't doing anything. So same is with the idea of literacy. And with that said, it kind of established supremacy of the people who are literate, So who can record record history? The person who will write, right? And ability to write is usually associated with the richer class, with the class who can afford, who can find time, who have the luxury to do that. So the knowledge would be very much in the hands of a certain class in that sense, and which we have seen absolutely. But with the oral culture, what happens, it disseminates the knowledge on a very grassroots levels, and everybody can access knowledge on the equal, or pretty much on the equal grounding and footing, and people have say in it. So for example, in our academia, we call it ivory towers, right? Why we call it ivory towers? Not everybody has access to it. So whatever theories are created, whatever ideas are created, the masses do not have say in those theories, and they cannot really alter those ways of thinking. So that establishes a certain level of supremacy of certain group of people in knowledge creation.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Yeah, that it gives bringing in a post-colonial critique to it. Other points. So, Maham, what do you mean by this proliferation of personal biases? Can you explain that into us? We can't hear you. आवाज नहीं आ रही शायद yeah, it's कोई मसला है. It's all right. पहले तो आ रही थी. I don't know what happened. It's okay.
अभी आपने म्यूट कर दिया गलती से.
अब किया है. पहले नहीं भी म्यूटेड था तो अब बोले. हाँ नहीं, अभी भी नहीं आ रही. All right. क्या आप लिख सकती हैं अगर थोड़ा सा एक्सप्लेन करें इसके क्या पर्सनल बायसेस क्या मतलब है? अच्छा, तो इसमें मार्टिन लिंग्स ने दो एग्जांपल्स जो दिए हैं, इसमें there's some other dimensions. उसमें एक तो generally memory जो है, या downside of literacy. Yes. Ma'am, I was just wondering about like personal biases. कैसे, how is it more open to personal biases rather than oral literature? Just make that connection. Like what? How do personal biases come with the written word more or something? So generally, for example, one of the very interesting things he wrote here is countless altogether illiterate men have been masters of highly elaborate languages. So this idea that that oral culture is sometimes preserved because it's memory. You have to preserve things within you. It's kind of I don't know if आपने से किसी ने यहाँ अमेरिका में तो काफी popular थी Ray Bradbury की 4,800 no what is it something 423 degrees Fahrenheit एक किताब है. Anybody is a science fiction writer. Anyways, उस किताब में basically the idea is that it's a future society in which books are banned, and so people have to get around this banning of books. It's a totalitarian society. So what people do is to memorize. Each person is assigned the kind of resistance movement. Each person memorizes one of the great classics of literature and then passes on to one other person or more than one other person. This is how knowledge is kept. But what this also means is a kind of a development of memory that, you're not outsourcing knowledge. That now, I mean, I even see it with my students, with the students, with all this supposed knowledge on our fingertips. Like my daughter, I tell her, मुझसे पूछना है शेख गूगल से जाके पूछ लो. It's like because so you don't, it becomes it's something. You don't need to memorize things. You don't need to remember things. Everything is at your fingertips. Knowledge is written down somewhere where you can go and find it. And this, of course, also degenerates language. That's one of the other arguments he makes, that you don't have to remember as many words. Language becomes less and less sophisticated. In fact, the older you go, languages like Arabic and Sanskrit and other kind of major languages, the more sophisticated these languages are, more capable of expressing the kind of panorama of human experience. Instead of exactly what you would expect, if we went from cavemen to very advanced people now, it should be the opposite. How has our language actually declined? So from a linguistic point of view, language is actually much more sophisticated and elaborate in the older you go, instead of a kind of evolution of or increase in sophistication of languages. And there's lots of other points, of course, he makes that, some of these things we could probably touch upon in other at other times. But going back to this idea of the very title of the book, one of the reasons this text is interesting is this idea of modern superstition, right? So ancient beliefs of modern superstition, because we think superstition, or at least lots of theorists believe that superstition belongs to particular cultures, particular time periods that are that are not modern Western, right? So it's and this calls forth the idea that you can, any kind of system of belief or a system of thinking can be called a superstition, or perhaps a more neutral term that could be called a myth, right? This idea of myth, doesn't even किसी को पता है myth का क्या मतलब है in the original? Myth in Greek means story, right? Myth आजकल जिस तरह इस्तेमाल होता है as a fallacy is a modern definition of myth. Myth is a story. So in a certain sense, modernity tells a particular story. This is a bit postmodern way of looking at it as well, but it's also a traditional way one could argue, is that everybody tells stories, and that our stories have just changed. And one can argue what story is better, but it's not one as if modern Europeans were the first people to discover factual things, and everybody else was kind of living in some kind of make-believe worlds or something like that. Rather, the idea is that even scientific perceptions of the world and worldviews are myths. There are particular ways of envisaging reality, right? That are very specific ways of looking at things that come from various historical contexts and changes, and are not, the final word. That everything that humans come up with is a particular myth, a story that tells about the world and about themselves. And so this is something that we'll take up on our next class, which will be on science and religion. I think one of the readings, I'm going to discuss it with the Mursab, how much reading we should give you. I don't know, is this too much reading or is this good enough? Kitna? Matlab, theek hai, zyada to nahi hai. Good. Achha, so for next class, we'll have two readings ho ya ek ho. So we'll discuss that. But agar wo reading na do aapko myth pe na bhi do, to we'll just talk about it then on different scientific theories seen as myths.
जी अब टाइम
मेरे ख्याल जुबैर साहब आपने
जुबैर साहब की
बड़ी देर से इंतजार कर रहा था। दो कमेंट्स हैं। एक तो अब 3 हो गए, आपने ये जो साइंस एंड रिलीजन का बताया, आसान से शुरू करता हूँ। वो जो फ़ारेनहाइट 451 है, बाय द वे, वो एक तो हाई स्कूल में एज अ टेक्स्ट पढ़ाई जाती है, यहाँ पर इट्स अ फेयरली नोन बुक। दूसरा ये कि मूवी बफ्स के लिए ये कि उसकी मूवी भी बन गई हुई है, तो वो आज जाके देख लीजिए, गुड मूवी। अच्छा, सवाल एक मेरा उस पे था जो लैंग्वेज का, क्योंकि फिर आपने मिथ्स की बात शुरू कर दी, लेकिन उसमें ये एक सवाल मेरा था, जरा शायद लंबा ना हो जाए इसलिए मैं आखिरी बात कर लेता हूँ। ये जो साइंस और रिलीजन का जो आपने कहा है, प्लीज उसका अगर आप हमें रीडिंग्स का रेफरेंस अभी से आज से दे दें, कोई किताब मंगवानी हो या कुछ लोगों के लिए फिजिकल बुक इज मोर इंटरेस्टिंग, तो वो की जा सकती है, अगर वो प्लीज आप कर दीजिए, वो बड़ा ही हमें। और आई थिंक आप उसमें मेरी फीडबैक ये है कि रीडिंग मेरे ख्याल में मुनासिब है, जो ज्यादा पढ़ना चाहे उसमें आप इस तरह भी कर सकते हैं कि ये मैंडेटरी रीडिंग है और ये ऑप्शनल है, तो जिसकी जितनी इस्तात है वो कर ले, जिसके पास टाइम नहीं है वो ना करें, ये भी हो सकता है
जी।
तो
ठीक।
अच्छा, मैं अब सवाल अपना पूछ लेता हूँ। वो जो लैंग्वेज की बात जो चल रही थी, उसमें एक सवाल उठा ये था कि कुछ तो हायर लैंग्वेजेस हैं, जिस तरह अरबिक, हिब्रू और ये जो रूट बेस्ड लैंग्वेजेस हैं। फिर कुछ मुझे ये इंप्रेशन मिला था वो पढ़ के लिंक साहब का, कि उन्होंने कुछ ये इंडिकेट किया कि एट द एंड ऑफ द डे लैंग्वेजेस भी बेबस हो जाती हैं इस चीज को इनकैप्सुलेट करने में, जो कहना चाह रहे हैं या जो विजडम है। तो ये कुछ, ये मेरा ख्याल है या ये उसकी तरफ भी इशारा करना चाह रहे थे वो जो ऑथर हैं?
जी हाँ, कि तो जस्ट टू रिट्रेट के मतलब कि लैंग्वेजेस जो हैं वो हाँ कि उनकी डिक्लाइन का डेफिनेटली एक ये एस्पेक्ट है कि उसमें आप उसकी लैक ऑफ सोफिस्टिकेशन की वजह से मतलब ऐसे हकीकत हैं जो कि आप आसानी से बयान नहीं कर सकते। So that's definitely और मगर उसमें could just be part of human experience कि मसलन अब जैसे मतलब आप एहसास साथ हैं। अब इंग्लिश में मुझे काफी मुश्किल लगता है, हालांकि मैंने डिग्री भी की है इंग्लिश में। लव जो है, लफ्स वो एक जेनेरिक सा लफ्स है, और भी हैं थोड़े मिलते जुलते अल्फाज, मगर एक सटलिटीज ऑफ मोहब्बत, इश्क अरबी और फारसी में जो थ्रू दैट उर्दू में जो पाई जाती हैं वो बहुत मुश्किल है बयान करनी। मतलब that's just an example. वो मुझे नहीं पता it's because of a decline of English language या मतलब it's just a cultural less sensitivity towards particular, जैसे अब मतलब कई दफा जिन कल्चर्स में किसी चीज पे थोड़ा सा फोकस होता है, उसके लिए जैसे मजाक करते हैं कि अरबी में तलवारों और ऊंटों के लिए सबसे ज्यादा अल्फाज है। एस्किमो जबान में कई 80 words for ice and snow। तो ऐसी बात भी हो सकती है, but part of it could be कि one could argue कि maybe certain मतलब आपकी both metaphysical realities or even aspects of human experience, आपकी languages get less and less capable of expressing. due to various reasons.
दुरुस्त.
Without,
एक और वो जो आखिरी सवाल था कि क्या ये लैंग्वेजेस एट द एंड ऑफ द डे फिर बेबस भी हो जाएंगी, या ये उस ख्याल को उन्होंने इजहार करने की कोशिश नहीं की, वो मैं वैसे ही एक्सट्रापोलेशन किया उसको
नहीं दोबारा
जी कि वो
दोबारा
कोई भी लैंग्वेज किसी हद तक भी चूंकि इट्स लिमिटेड बाय द नाउन्स या इसम जो सिखाए गए हैं, या वो उसको मुख्तलिफ वर्ड्स यूज करते हैं किसी फीलिंग को, किसी ख्याल को, किसी चीज को डिस्क्राइब करने के लिए, तो क्या ऐसा भी हो सकता है कि लैंग्वेज एट द एंड ऑफ द डे मतलब नॉट एवरीथिंग कुड बी इनकैप्सुलेटेड बाय दैट, लेकिन उससे बियॉन्ड फिर फीलिंग्स, एहसासात, कुछ और ही मीडियम होना चाहिए, वर्ड्स उसका फिर अहाता नहीं कर सकते उन चीजों का?
I mean, I think that's open for conversation, right?
Okay.
मतलब हो सकता है. I mean, another एक उनका interesting point जो था कि in some way कि पहले words जो थे वो किसी level पे correspond करते थे more directly to the experience. They captured something directly of the experience. अगर आप तो थोड़ा सा those people kind of have a opening towards poetry, उसके थ्रू आपको थोड़ा ये चीज नजर आ सकती है, या इंग्लिश में आना पड़ता है, या मतलब एक repetition of words in a particular way or use of there's a correspondence between a lived reality and language जो कि abstract thinking की वजह से वो you slowly lose that. कि आपकी abstract जुबान होती जाती है, या it's reflecting the less you are actually connected with reality. अगर आप बस कंप्यूटर बैठे हुए हैं या सिर्फ social reality से आपका connection है, with the full lived experience of nature and उससे आप it affects how much language is affected. मैं थोड़ा सा इस वक्त का बहुत टाइम हो गया, तो I'm a little bit conscious of that कि आपको बहुत, yeah, some of you आप शायद have other commitments and so on, so we can wrap it up. Unless अगर कोई और किसी ने सवाल वगैरह पूछना है तो I can be here from. Otherwise,
they send you the सवाल through us. I mean, they can. वो तो इंशाल्लाह चलता रहेगा. So we should end the session, I think. फिर आप वो रीडिंग मुझे भेजिए, फिर मैं शेयर कर लूँगा इन सबसे.
हाँ, एक और दूसरी मैं फिर एक किताब में लिख देता हूँ, साइंस एंड मिथ व्हाट वी आर नेवर टोल्ड, वो भी है, मतलब that could be recommended reading शायद.
फिर we can send आप, चले मर्जी.
हाँ ठीक है, that's I just put it इसलिए कि जुबैर साहब कह रहे थे आज फौरन अगर उन्होंने ऑर्डर कर लिया, but that's fine. I just
सही है सही. Science and Myths.
Science and Myth किताब का नाम है, बस title है what we are never told, मेरा ख्याल है something like that. Wolfgang Smith की, और actually मतलब it's I don't think बहुत ज़्यादा लंबा नहीं है. Chapter 1 देखता हूँ मैं एक सेकंड कितना लंबा है. And it's about 16 pages, so I would recommend कि आप at least आप skim कर ले इसको, अगर if you don't have the time to read it. बारबोर का definitely read करें, और स्मिथ का भी read करने की पूरी कोशिश करें. If you don't have time, then you can just skim it.
ठीक है जी, स्टूडेंट्स अब थैंक यू. अच्छी, बहुत जबरदस्त, अच्छी रही क्लास.
बहुत शुक्रिया जी.
टेक केयर, खुदा हाफिज, इंशाल्लाह.
खुदा हाफिज.